Annette, a 29-year-old caregiver who lived with and cared for her grandmother Dorothy after losing her parents, sits through a family while reading where her entitled Uncle Lawrence and cousins presumed Dorothy's estate for themselves. Secretly, Dorothy recorded a video and prepared a real will, leaving everything to Annette as reward and vindication for her years of devoted care. The staged fake will triggers the family's greed. Then Dorothy's recorded testimony and an official attorney confirm the true disposition. The house, investments, and jewelry go to Annette. The relatives' reputations and plans collapse, while Annette inherits both material security and moral justice. The room smelled like lemon oil and old paper. Dorothy's house held time like a chest. Cardigans draped over chairs, a chessboard with one knight still standing, sun through rain-streaked window panes. Guests arrived as if for a performance. Lawrence walked in with a briefcase and the practiced tilt of a man who'd learned how to own a room. Patricia hugged him like a life preserver. Vincent scanned the living room as if inventorying merchandise. I sat where Dorothy used to sit, knees tucked under an afghan, and felt the air tighten with expectation. "Whatever you don't want," Lawrence announced before any papers were opened, smiling the way a man smiles when he has already counted the spoils. His words hung in the space as if they were prime meat. Patricia's phone came out and, without ceremony, she began snapping photos of the mantel, the glass cabinet of teacups. Vincent checked his watch twice. Benjamin, the family's lawyer, arranged his papers like a concession to propriety. Outside, Portland rain stitched the sky to the ground, patient, gray, indifferent. They'd rehearsed this in their heads. They had rehearsed not knowing Dorothy's tenderness. That tenderness had been my steady weather. I'd been 13 this summer my father died and Dorothy became my household and my rhythm. She taught me how to fold fitted sheets so they looked like little houses, how to measure sugar by feel, how to say the names of things out loud so grief would learn to live without shouting. While they were passing by, I was learning residence. That was the difference. They inherited a surname. I inherited a life. When Lawrence described the house as practical for Patricia, his voice slid over the truth like a knife over paper. Announcements of convenience were how families rerouted compassion into ledger lines. I answered with silence and a measured look back at Dorothy's armchair, its upholstery softened where she read aloud. Memory is an anchor until it isn't. Dorothy had been small and precise, the kind of woman who watched not for spectacle but for habit. Her watching felt protective. It was the kind of protection that notices the small thefts, a cousin's absence at a birthday, a son's loan that never returned. No one noticed the little things she left in my care, a stack of recipe cards, a folded map with handwritten routes, a battered camera tucked in tissue. They mistook absence for disinterest, presence for obligation. Lawrence assumed his role, Patricia assumed what fit her narrative, Vincent expected a cash flow. But the house hummed with other preparations, the unassuming kind that collect in drawers, a list of bank visits scribbled on the back of a grocery receipt, dates circled in a careful hand. If you listened long enough, you could hear Dorothy arranging a plan like one arranges flowers, each stem deliberately placed. Benjamin cleared his throat. The room inhaled. When he reached for the will, I felt the strap of my purse like a line between the present and something Dorothy had entrusted to me. My thumb found a tiny object against leather, a USB with no flourish, nothing heraldic about it. It fit easily into a pocket of my palm, the sort of thing you could forget you carried until you needed it. That small weight made my chest quiet in a way I'd never felt before. This was no act of vengeance. It was a measure Dorothy chose in private, a ledger balanced in her own time. Outside, rain leaned against the glass like an audience. Inside, the family's rehearsal came to life, but the script they expected to follow had been changed, line by line, in rooms they had thought they knew. I sat steady, quiet as a witness, as if being still could keep what was true from being broken. Dorothy had watched for years. Now she was ready to speak. When I said I'd moved in after my mother left, people nodded as if that explained everything. But grief doesn't tidy itself into explanations. It arrives like an ongoing weather. You learn the barometer. Dorothy taught me that. She poured tea until the kettle sang, and then taught me how to listen to that sing for meaning. Those small attentions had become our ritual. I checked her appointments, refilled her pillbox, learned when her hands trembled because she was tired and when because she was frightened. To me, those were not burdens, they were conversation. The room felt different as Benjamin read the fake will. The language was legal, careful, bland, the cadence of someone trying to make a lie sound like a fact. Lawrence relaxed into possession. Patricia fluffed an imagined dining nook. Vincent counted invisible zeros. Every casual claim, the house for Patricia, the accounts for Vincent, was a tiny erasure. It wasn't just about money, it was about being made small by being made redundant. They'd rehearsed entitlement until it sounded like care. Between paragraphs, I kept replaying the last months with Dorothy, evenings with the lamp on low while she corrected my posture at the piano, mornings when she asked, genuinely, about my work at North Peak Engineering and listened with a curiosity that did not want a return on investment. She asked about my plans. She asked questions that made me think in sentences I hadn't used in years. That attention felt like currency, expensive, rare, and warming. They didn't see the currency I carried. They couldn't read the notes tucked into drawers, the letters Dorothy had written and never sent, fragments of worry, lists of bank appointment dates, a line about how often she'd heard someone say, "It's only money," and felt that sentence like a bruise. She had been arranging legal details quietly, not to spite, but to preserve the dignity of her days. These were acts of love disguised as paperwork. When Benjamin's voice shaped the sentence about my granddaughter, Annette, the room snapped like a string. The phrasing was gentle, designed to be sentimental in a way that withered in the sunlight of Lawrence's smugness. It landed like a consolation prize. I saw Patricia's lips purse and Vincent's smirk. Lawrence rubbed his hands together the way a man who bargains with futures does. My fingers closed over the USB under the flap of my purse. It was a private thing, Dorothy's trust, not spectacle. I felt oddly protective of it, as if the device were a fragile bird. The plan was simple. The recording would play, truth would speak, consequences would follow. Yet, even with the plan in place, my stomach pitched. I'd been raised to avoid spectacle. Confrontation felt foreign. But Dorothy had not only raised me, she had read me. She knew where my courage lived, tucked between my ribs where the habit of care hardened into backbone. Benjamin glanced at me, that small, silent question. I nodded once. The decision felt less like rebellion and more like honoring a promise. Dorothy's voice had been a steady thing in a life that often felt adrift, honoring it was right. The laptop whirred. For a breath, everyone in the room had the same light hit their faces, the cool blue of a screen. Outside, the rain kept its patient work. As the video began, I could feel the room tilt, as if gravity itself was adjusting. The family's confidence hinged on assumptions. The camera would unhinge them. It was intimate, a private testimony turned public, and I worried for them, not because I wanted to hurt them, but because truth can be a harsh medicine. I'd watched Dorothy plan, and now I watched the seconds tick down until her voice would carry across the living room like a verdict. The image on the screen was Dorothy in her blue cardigan, the camera framing her like a portrait she'd always refused to have taken. The timestamp in the corner read 2 weeks before her death. She looked composed, direct, not the frail woman they'd tried to make her into. When she spoke, it wasn't a fragile murmur, but a clear, painstakingly steady address. "If you are watching this," she began, and the room leaned in like a ship catching wind. Her words were surgical. She named moments, small, precise memories that only someone living in the life could know, a scar from a childhood bike fall, a rabbit stuffed from 6-year-old nights, a detail about a borrowed $200 bill, and the lie told around it. Each naming cut through the fog of denial, replacing plausible deniability with the cold, verifiable specificity of lived truth. Faces shifted. Lawrence's color changed first, Patricia's smile evaporated, Vincent's phone slipped from his hand like an exposed nerve. Dorothy explained the fake will as if narrating an experiment. "I wanted to see what would happen if I placed my finances on stage," she said. Her voice carried no malice, only a firmness that made the room small. It wasn't merely exposure, it was assessment. She had watched for patterns. Visits that only came with asks, hands that reached for possession before bedside, concern that arrived on schedules matching benefit payments. For each pattern she described, she had evidence in dates and signed papers and a bank box quietly containing the real will. The pivot felt like a page turned. Attribution shifted from rumor and accusation to recorded fact. Benjamin's brow furrowed, not with confusion, but with a professional curiosity that would soon be respect. He repeated the safe deposit box number aloud, and even the casual observer could see his fingers begin the legal choreography. Phone out, notes, confirmation. When Dorothy looked at the camera and praised my name, calling me companion, confidant, the one who showed up, her affection landed like a benediction. My eyes blurred, not because of triumph but because of being seen. Lawrence rose. Rage is a predictable thing when entitlement collapses. He accused the recording of being manufactured, medication-induced, a forgery. His voice sharpened. I recognized the argument, the gasps of those who have been unmasked for misreading someone they thought they knew. Dorothy had anticipated that, though. She had prepared countermeasures, appointment logs, conversations with her doctor, financial advisor notes. The evidence was not theatrical, it was administrative and mundane, and that everydayness became its credibility. Then the phone rang, Wilson and Associates, punctuating the reveal as if cueing a curtain call. Theodore Wilson's voice was calm, professional. The real will existed, he confirmed. He said he'd been instructed to contact the family at exactly this time. The timing was not theatrical coincidence, it was deliberate staging. As the words settled, the room's symmetry broke. Where before there'd been a comfortable choreography of assumption, there was now disorder and disbelief. In the silence that followed Dorothy's final sentence, that her entire estate went to me, a new weight settled. It wasn't triumph alone that pressed on my chest, it was responsibility. Dorothy had not only redistributed property, she'd given me a role, steward of her life's work and a moral verdict. There was electricity in the room, the spark between justice and humiliation. Their faces read a syntax of loss, shock, anger, the bruise of social consequence. For the first time in my life, I saw my reflection in the eyes of those who had long dismissed me. They were looking at someone they'd underestimated, and that gaze felt as strange as stepping into sunlight after living for years beneath eaves. I felt no exultation. Instead, a soft gravity, what to do with both the inheritance and the aftertaste of exposure. Dorothy's plan had worked, but now the future demanded choices. In the quiet aftermath, I realized one truth: justice is quieter than revenge and carries more weight. Lawrence was the first to speak, as if speech could reclaim lost ground. Words about contesting the will poured from him, legal threats, claims of incapacity, murmurs about medication. He wanted to turn the room back into the boardroom he'd preferred. But the mechanics Dorothy had laid down were not theatrical, they were procedural. Benjamin and the voice on the speaker, Theodore Wilson, reminded everyone of signatures, notarizations, and authenticated recordings. The law is an instrument that rarely succumbs to the heat of indignation. In the small glare from the laptop screen, I saw the new landscape of responsibility. Dorothy had left me more than assets. She'd left an expectation. Her life's savings were not for indulgence, but preservation, she had said. As the primary beneficiary, I would be asked to make decisions, probate appointments, executor duties, handling a memorial foundation she'd half-joked about in her last months. It wasn't simply money, it was legacy administration, stewardship of a memory, and perhaps a chance to fix small wrongs on a larger scale. Sitting there, I felt an unfamiliar tension between two impulses. Part of me wanted to savor the validation, to take them down in speech and virtue, but another part wanted to collapse into silence and privacy. Dorothy had never wanted spectacle. She wanted dignity. Her video was corrective, not punitive. I thought of the look in her eyes the night she taught me how to fold fitted sheets to look like little houses, that loving attention that makes a nest solid. The cousins pivoted from stunned victims to activists for their own innocence. Patricia cried so hard it sounded like coughing. Vincent paced. Lawrence became a man mapping legal landscapes. They wanted narrative control back. Outside their personal hurt, Something else rippled. A small circle of neighbors and community acquaintances who had heard the will reading would now carry rumor and judgment. In Portland, where small social networks shine bright and stay lit, reputation is a fragile currency. Benjamin advised caution. You can contest a will, he said, voice low. But you can only contest it on specific grounds. He looked at Lawrence with an expression that had none of the warmth the man assumed he'd earned. The lawyer's posture was a quiet rebuke. The truth had been authenticated. Litigation would be messy, public, and slow, the kind of thing that erodes goodwill and draws attention to private fractures. That prospect of extended public legal battles shifted the stakes. If Lawrence pursued litigation, the family would oxidize under scrutiny. Their casual assumptions about who they were and what they deserved would be transcribed into public record, bank statements, witness depositions, medical logs. Private skeletons would have to step into daylight. The thought of that ledger being opened made Patricia's husband call late at night. Vincent received cold messages from potential investors who suddenly questioned his ethics. Consequences sprouted like roots when salt hits soil. I felt the weight of Dorothy's will settle across my shoulders like a shawl that was both warm and heavy. To accept the estate would be to inherit not only material security, but the role of arbiter and caretaker. It meant deciding whether to leverage Dorothy's story for wider change, perhaps the foundation she'd half said, or to compartmentalize the hurt and continue the quiet life she'd loved. The decision was not about gloating, it was about legacy. In the hush, as plans for probate were arranged and voices moved from shock to logistics, I met each of their gazes in turn. Lawrence's face had the guarded hardness of a man rebuilding. Patricia's shame made her small in the corner. Vincent's anger had sharpened into a brittle determination. None of them looked at me as they once had. Some looked with accusation, others with a dawning sense of loss. I could punish them through legal remedies, but that would be a long, bruising path. Instead, I thought of Dorothy's hands, the way they shaped a biscuit, the way she smoothed the sheets. Justice, I felt, should reflect her hand, practical, kind, unglamorous. The house was hers, the money had her fingerprints on it. My duty had a shape, to honor the quiet acts of care and prohibit their trivialization. That resolve tightened into a decision I did not yet voice. The family would learn consequences, yes, but not to feed my vanity. They would learn it because Dorothy had taught me that stewardship is the truest measure of love. The day after the reading was a blur of signatures, counsel, and questions that smelled like curiosity and doom. Theodore Wilson's office smelled of lemon cleaner and paper. The receptionist smiled a practiced professional smile at my name, as if it were a title that required no unpacking. As I sat across from a desk, Dorothy's voice lingered in my head. Stewardship, dignity, care. I could feel the family's expectations, resentment masked as bargaining, like weather on the horizon. Lawrence arrived at the attorney's office with papers and posture. He wanted one last theater, a pretrial audition for public sympathy. He came in with a list of witnesses to speak to Dorothy's state of mind, with a stack of old conversations, with pleas rehearsed and passed between lawyers the night before. He wanted the narrative that had been appended to be rewritten in his favor. His confidence was brittle now. Public whispers had already found cracks in his professional standing. We sat in mediation for hours. In those long stretches, faces tire into truth. The adrenaline that masks intention fades. What remains is human. Lawrence's voice broke, not from repentance, but from fear of consequence, of exposure. He described himself as a son trying to protect his mother. Patricia sobbed and made pleading explanations about stress and obligations. Vincent offered fragments of remorse that sounded like loose coins. I listened. For a moment, a memory of my father's laugh flickered across my mind as if to suggest mercy. It would have been easy to use the legal machinery as a sword. The law could have been an instrument of humiliation. My signature could have been leveraged to shut them out forever. But Dorothy's plan had been specific, to be seen, to unmask patterns, and to entrust care to someone who understood it. I held her intent in both hands, and felt the gravity of choosing how to honor it. When the room quieted, I realized I didn't want vindictiveness. I wanted reform and accountability. So I proposed a different path, an arrangement that required public acknowledgement of wrongdoing and commitment to therapy and community service centered around elder care. Part of the estate would fund a Dorothy Morrison Memorial Foundation for elder care. Another portion would provide restitution and financial education for those in the family who had been reckless. The house would remain mine as a primary residence, but with the stipulation that certain rooms be used for community gatherings and support workshops. It was not punishment for pleasure, it was structural change. Lawrence's face collapsed into something between incredulity and relief. His initial protest was loud, but the possibility of litigation still loomed, expensive and reputation-eating. He signed with a hand that trembled. Patricia, who had expected a windfall, signed documents that required transparency and attendance at elder care education programs. Vincent, whose investors had already received whispers, accepted mandatory financial counseling tied to a small trust fund with conditions. The agreements felt like scaffolding being placed around faults so a building might be made safe again. As pen scratched the paper, I felt something shift in the room. Where there had been a theatrical reveal and an immediate urge to crush, there was now the slow mechanism of repair. Dorothy's victory was not a single image, it was a structure built to encourage better choices. I could have taken all and closed the door. Instead, I accepted a more complicated inheritance, resources, responsibility, and a mandate to transform pain into practice. When we left the office, daylight felt both colder and cleaner. The family walked out in a shuffle of changed roles. For the first time in years, my name felt like a designation of honor, not apology. Dorothy's plan had done more than teach them a lesson, it made room for a different kind of future. The sting of exposure remained, but in its wake, a shape of accountability had been forged, visible, enforceable, and practical. It wasn't catharsis performed for an audience, it was repair designed to last. Months later, the house smelled the way Dorothy used to make it smell: lemon, rosemary, a faint scent of cardamom from the last batch of cookies she taught me to fold. The Dorothy Morrison Memorial Foundation opened quietly in the living room, where a circle of folding chairs held neighbors, volunteers, and a few of the cousins who followed through. We offered workshops on elder advocacy, financial planning for caregivers, and a simple hotline that helped families navigate medical appointments. The foundation was not a monument to spite, it was a practical answer to the small cruelties that had been normalized. Lawrence's clients dwindled. Reputation, once assumed, had been exposed to scrutiny and slowly faded. Patricia and her husband faced a winter of tense conversations that required them to evaluate how they'd measured love. Vincent's business recovered slowly, but with stricter oversight and a newfound need to prove responsibility. Consequences had a way of reshaping the future quietly, which is perhaps more effective than a dramatic downfall, the long, dull work of changing habit. For me, the inheritance allowed things that grief had made impossible: a small rental property to stabilize my budget, funds to complete a master's course in community planning, and enough capital to hire a coordinator for the foundation so I could still breathe between obligations. But better than financial breathing room was a reframed identity. Where I had been the daughter who was always there, I became a steward with the power to transform pain into resources for others. Dorothy's last lesson had been less about retribution and more about re-examination. Notice what people do, not what they promise. Sometimes, when the afternoon light slants just so through the dining room, I place a teacup on the table and feel Dorothy's presence like a warmth that hasn't left. People stop by for small things: advice, a donated sweater, a listening ear, and the house resumes its purpose as a place for ordinary care. The foundation funds small grants for families who cannot afford companion care, and each grant comes with a short note about dignity. We measure success not in headlines, but in calls from caregivers who no longer feel alone. I am not immune to private moments of bitterness. When Lawrence's name comes up in neighborhood conversations, a whisper here, a judgment there, I sometimes taste the old ache. But the ache is sharper and shorter now because it is framed by a larger work. Dorothy's camera did not simply reveal faults, it catalyzed infrastructure for change. She taught me the power of deliberate planning, that love preserved in paper and recorded voice could outlast entitlement and neglect. At night, in the quiet that used to press like humidity, I sometimes take out her recipe cards. I fold them open and cook something small, letting steam and spice stitch ordinary hours back together. The house is full of guests now who come for workshops, not to take. Children run through the rooms. Volunteers set up tables for meetings. An older woman brings knitting and tells a story about her mother. The life Dorothy protected has become a place where others can learn to be less careless. In the end, the inheritance was never the point. The point was what Dorothy taught: the logistics of care matter. Names on a document can change the course of lives, but kindness arranged into systems can move a community. She left me an estate, yes, but also a mandate to make the small acts of love legible and available to others. I light the lamp at dusk and speak her name like thanks. Justice arrived in quiet, deliberate work, not a moment of spectacle, but a lifetime of rearranged days.